Somewhere in the world right now, a grandmother is telling a story to a child about a great flood that swallowed the old world. In another house, in another country, with a completely different language and completely different gods, someone else is telling almost the exact same story, and they have never met. They have never traded books or shared maps. Their ancestors may never have crossed paths in any recorded history, and yet the story is the same. Waters rising, a warning, a handful of survivors, a world rebuilt from almost nothing. That's not a coincidence that's easy to dismiss. That's a question. This episode is about that question. Why do so many ancient cultures, separated by oceans and mountain ranges and thousands of years, remember the same kind of ending? Was there a single catastrophe so enormous it burned itself into human memory before memory had any other way to survive? Was it something in the human mind, the way we're wired to imagine destruction and survival? Or did stories travel between peoples the way seeds travel on wind, landing in new soil and growing into something that looks different but shares the same root? There are three possibilities, and they are all interesting. And the honest answer is probably a mixture of all three. But getting to that answer means walking through some of the most fascinating territory in human history. The line where geology meets mythology, where oral tradition meets climate science, where the stories we tell in the dark turn out to contain fossils of real events. Before we go any further, one thing needs to be said clearly. Myths are not newspapers. They do not report facts with precision. They compress centuries into single moments. They assign names and faces to forces that had no names and no faces. They borrow from other stories and blend into local traditions and shift with each retelling across generations. When a myth says the sea rose and swallowed the coast, it is almost certainly not recording a date or a measurement, but it might be recording a pattern, and patterns matter. Think of it this way. If you found 100 letters from different cities written in different languages, all describing a red sky and a sound like thunder that came from the east, you might not know exactly what happened, but you would know something happened. The letters themselves become evidence, not of the precise event, but of the fact that something was experienced. That is what we are dealing with when we look at flood myths and fire myths and darkness myths from cultures that had no contact with each other, not proof, but signal. A pattern so consistent it cannot be entirely random noise. Tonight we're going to walk through that signal together. We'll look at which specific catastrophes might have been real enough and severe enough to leave impressions in oral tradition. We'll talk about the science of what the Earth was actually doing at the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were rising fast and volcanoes were erupting and comets were possibly falling from the sky. We'll look at specific sites where archaeology and geology actually line up with what ancient stories describe. And we'll be honest about the places where the evidence runs thin and the tempting theory outpaces what we actually know. This is not a show that will tell you the ancient myths were literally true, or that there was a single global flood that one man survived on a boat. The world is more interesting and more complicated than that. But it is also a show that takes seriously the idea that very old stories can carry very real information, preserved not in stone tablets, but in the structure of the story itself, passed from mouth to mouth across hundreds of generations. That is something the human mind is extraordinarily good at. We are a storytelling species. We remembered things before we wrote. We warned each other before we had warning systems. We mapped coastlines in songs before we had cartography. The question is how much of that mapping survived, and how literally we should read it. If you're using this to fall asleep tonight, that is exactly what it's made for. There is something about walking slowly through deep time, through questions this old and landscapes this vast, that has a way of loosening the grip the present has on your mind. So settle in, get comfortable, Let the topics wash over you at whatever depth feels right. Some of you will catch every detail. Some of you will drift somewhere peaceful halfway through. Both outcomes are completely fine. And while you're getting comfortable, I genuinely want to know where you are right now. Drop it in the comments. The city, the country, the time. It doesn't have to be more than that. Just wherever you are. Because one of the things that makes this particular episode feel alive to me is that you might be in Tokyo at sunrise, or Dublin at 2 a.m, or lying on a couch in Sao Paulo at midnight, and you're all listening to the same question about a catastrophe that may have touched all of our ancestors. That feels worth marking somehow. The event we're going to spend this episode exploring happened at the boundary of prehistory and deep time. It sits in the period before writing, before cities, before the earliest recorded myths were even composed. And yet somehow, echoes of it may have survived in stories that were still being told thousands of years later. Stories that scribes eventually pressed into clay and carved into stone. Stories that became the oldest texts we have. Whatever actually happened at the end of the last ice age, it was big enough and bad enough and close enough to living memory that people felt the need to tell their children, and their children told their children. And somewhere in that long chain of telling, across languages and continents and centuries, something made it all the way to us. Let's go find out what it was. Before we start comparing stories across continents, it's worth spending some time understanding what myths actually are and what they actually do. Because if you go into this thinking, a myth is just a failed attempt at science, a primitive explanation for things people didn't understand yet, you'll miss most of what makes them interesting, and you'll also miss the way they can carry real information in forms that look nothing like information. Myths are doing several things at once. In almost every culture that has them, they're establishing identity. This is who we are. This is where we came from. This is why our people exist and why our way of life is the right way. They're also doing ethics. The stories teach you what happens to people who violate the community's values, what the gods reward, what they punish, what behavior sustains a group through hard times. They're doing cosmology too, explaining the structure of the world, why the sky is where it is, why the seasons change, why death exists. And they are doing something that often gets overlooked. They're carrying warnings. Danger came from this direction once. Water rose to this height once. The sky went dark, and the crops failed and people starved, and here is how our ancestors survived. Remember this. That last function is the one that matters most for our purposes tonight. Because warnings don't need to be precise to be useful. A warning that says the sea can rise and swallow the coast does not need to include the date, the exact water level, or a geological explanation. It just needs to be remembered and repeated until it reaches the generation that needs it. Oral traditions are actually remarkably good at this kind of preservation. There's a tendency in modern thinking to assume that anything passed down through spoken word across many generations must be thoroughly garbled. Like a long game of telephone where the original message dissolves into noise. And that is sometimes true. Details do change, names shift, characters get added and removed. But the core structure of a story, especially a story tied to a strong emotional event, can be extraordinarily stable. Linguists and anthropologists have documented traditions in Aboriginal Australia that appear to contain accurate descriptions of geographical features, including coastlines and volcanic events that would have looked very different 10,000 years ago. The emotional weight of a catastrophic event seems to act like a kind of preservation pressure. The more terrifying the thing being remembered, the more carefully the community tends to guard the memory of it. What changes is the frame, not the kernel. The kernel is something like, water came, it covered the land, very few survived, the world had to be rebuilt. The frame is everything else, the name of the hero, the reason the gods were angry, the type of vessel, the animal sent out to find land. These details are local. They belong to the culture that's doing the remembering. They get swapped out and shaped by existing beliefs and neighbouring stories and the particular landscape of wherever the community lives. So when we look at flood myths from Mesopotamia and Greece and India and the Pacific Islands and Mesoamerica, we expect the frames to look different. What's interesting is when the kernels match. Scholars who work in this territory use a set of overlapping methods to figure out what they're actually looking at. Motif comparison is one of the oldest. You identify the recurring structural elements across stories from different traditions and ask which combinations appear too frequently to be explained by chance. A flood that destroys a previous world and leaves a small group of survivors who repopulate the earth is one of the most widely distributed motifs in human storytelling. The question researchers ask is whether that distribution is the result of shared experience, shared psychology, or shared storytelling networks. Linguistics adds another layer. Languages change in predictable ways. By analysing how related words cluster across language families, researchers can sometimes trace how ideas moved between populations and roughly when. If a particular story motif appears in languages that branched apart 3,000 years ago, it suggests the story predates that branching. If it appears across language families that have been separate for 10,000 years, that's a very different kind of signal. Archaeology and geology then provide the external check. The test of a genuinely good theory about myth and memory is not just that the story sounds like it could describe a real event, it's that the real event left physical evidence that can be independently dated and measured. Sea level data, ice cores, sediment layers with tsunami signatures, ash deposits from volcanic eruptions. When the physical record and the oral record point in the same direction, that convergence means something. When they don't, that matters too. Source criticism is the part that requires the most discipline, and it's also the part most often skipped by people who are excited about a theory. Every ancient text that has come down to us passed through many hands before it reached us. Scribes copied it and sometimes changed it. Editors shaped it to fit religious or political purposes. Later redactors harmonized contradictory versions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains one of the oldest written flood narratives we have, was compiled from older oral sources, rewritten multiple times, and exists today in fragmentary versions that don't entirely agree with each other. Before we can say what the story means, we need to think carefully about when each version was written, who wrote it, what they were trying to accomplish, and what older material they were drawing on. Now here is where the pitfalls come in, because there are serious ones, and this episode is not going to pretend otherwise. The first pitfall is cherry-picking. The human mind is extraordinarily good at finding patterns, and it is also extraordinarily good at noticing the patterns it was already looking for while ignoring the ones that don't fit. If you go into the world's mythology specifically searching for flood stories, you will find an impressive number. What you might not notice as readily is how many cultures have no flood tradition at all, or have flood traditions that function completely differently, or where the flood is a minor element rather than a civilization-ending catastrophe. Honest comparison requires accounting for the absences, not just the matches. The second pitfall is forcing matches. Two stories can share a surface similarity, floods, a hero, a rescue, a new beginning, while having completely different structures, meanings, and probable origins. The temptation to declare them the same story, separated by geography and time, can outrun what the evidence actually supports. Similarity is a starting point for investigation, not a conclusion. The third pitfall is treating similarity as proof of a shared event. Even if you establish that a story pattern is genuinely widespread and genuinely old, that doesn't automatically mean it describes something that physically happened. Some patterns are widespread because they reflect something universal about how human beings experience the world. We all live on the surface of a planet that occasionally floods, shakes, and darkens. We all have bodies that respond to danger the same way. Stories that tap into those universal experiences will naturally converge on similar imagery, regardless of whether their authors were connected. Distinguishing between convergence from shared experience and convergence from shared psychology is genuinely difficult, and anyone who tells you the answer is obvious either way is probably oversimplifying. What we're going to try to do in the rest of this episode is something more modest and, I would argue, more interesting than arriving at a single definitive answer. We're going to look at specific candidates, specific catastrophic events that happened at the end of the last ice age and in the millennia just after, events that left clear physical signatures and that plausibly fell within the range of oral tradition. We're going to compare those events against the mythological record, not to prove that the myths are accurate history, but to ask a more careful question. Does the physical record explain the distribution and character of these stories better than other explanations do? Sometimes the answer will be yes. The match is striking and the geography lines up and the timeline works, and it's hard to explain the story any other way. Sometimes the answer will be more ambiguous. Sometimes it will be genuinely unclear, and the honest response will be to say so and move on rather than push a satisfying but unsupported theory. This is not a field where certainty comes easily, and that's actually part of what makes it worth exploring carefully. The serious researchers who work at the intersection of archaeology, geology, and mythology are not looking for proof that ancient stories are literally true. They're looking for something subtler, preserved signal inside reshaped narrative, the original shape of a real event distorted by thousands of years of retelling but still legible if you know how to look. What we know for certain is that the world at the end of the last ice age was doing extraordinary things. Coastlines were changing at rates people could watch within their own lifetimes. Volcanoes were erupting. Ice dams were collapsing, fires were sweeping across landscapes. The earth was violent in ways that would have been impossible to ignore, impossible not to talk about, and nearly impossible to forget. The question is how much of that got into the stories, and there is really only one way to find out. When people start listing flood myths, they usually begin in the same place, Mesopotamia. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates is where some of our oldest written stories come from, and it is also a place that floods in ways that are both generous and terrifying. The Sumerian flood story, the one that later gets woven into the Epic of Gilgamesh, centers on a man usually called Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, depending on the version. The gods decide to wipe out humanity with a flood. One god, moved by pity or by politics, warns a single human. That human is told to build a great boat, to load it with his family and with animals, and to ride out a world-destroying deluge. After days of darkness and water, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. Birds are sent out to test whether the land is dry. When one does not return, the survivor knows the waters have receded. A sacrifice is offered. The gods smell the offering, regret the total destruction they almost achieved, and a kind of new world begins. A few hundred miles and a couple of millennia away, another tradition takes shape in the highlands and deserts around Canaan. The Hebrew version in Genesis is not a simple copy of the Mesopotamian stories, but it is very clearly in conversation with them. Again, there is a divine decision to send a flood. Again, there is a chosen man, Noah this time, who receives a warning and detailed instructions for a vessel. The ark is built to exact proportions, filled with his family and with animals after their kind. Rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights, but the water remains on the earth for much longer. The ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. Birds are sent out, a raven first, then a dove. The dove returns with an olive leaf, then doesn't return at all. God makes a covenant marked by a rainbow, that such a flood will not happen again, a wiped clean world, a handful of survivors, animals preserved, a restart. Move over to Greece and the pattern bends but doesn't disappear. The story of Deucalion and Pyrrha begins with Zeus deciding that humanity has become corrupt. He chooses to drown them all in a flood. The Titan Prometheus warns his son Deucalion, telling him to build a chest, often translated as a kind of large box or boat. Deucalion and his wife climb aboard, and when the waters rise and the world is covered, they drift for 9 days before landing on Mount Parnassus. When the waters recede, they step onto a devastated Earth. Instead of repopulating the world through ordinary childbirth, they throw stones over their shoulders that transform into new humans, a mythic way of saying the human race was refounded from something durable and enduring, the bones of the Earth itself. If you move east into India, you meet Manu, the figure who plays a similar role in some Hindu traditions. In one early version, he is washing his hands in a river when a small fish begs him for protection. Manu keeps the fish, and it grows larger and larger until he realizes this is no ordinary creature. The fish, identified in later texts with the god Vishnu, warns Manu that a great flood is coming and instructs him to build a boat. When the deluge arrives, Manu ties his craft to the horn of the now enormous fish, who tows him to safety. The flood sweeps away everything else. Manu performs a sacrifice on the receding waters. From that sacrifice, or from his later actions, humans and other living things arise in a renewed world. Across the water in China, the major water stories look different on the surface, but still circle the same fears. The most famous is the tale of the great Yu, who spends years battling vast, uncontrollable floods that threaten to drown the land. In many versions, the catastrophe is already underway when the story begins. Instead of one man saving a small group in a single arc, Yu organizes massive engineering works, dredging channels, cutting new riverbeds, guiding the waters out to sea. What survives in the legend is not a boat, but a kind of civilizational arc, coordinated labor, hydraulic knowledge, the idea that humans can cooperate to tame dangerous water. The end result is a habitable landscape and a new political order. Yu becomes the founder of a dynasty, the world made livable again. Farther south and east, flood stories continue to appear in local forms. In parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, there are tales of a great wave or a rising sea that chases people up mountains or onto rafts. In some Polynesian traditions, islands themselves sink and rise. In one Tahitian version, the god Ta'aroa sends a flood that covers the world except for a single mountain peak where a few humans survive. In the highlands of South Asia, Himalayan communities tell of valleys once filled with water, drained by gods or heroes who cut gorges through the rock. The memory of real glacial lakes and landslides mixes with divine intervention. On the other side of the world, among indigenous cultures of the Americas, the motif appears again in dozens of variations. In some versions from the Pacific Northwest, a great flood comes without much warning. People survive by tying their canoes to the tops of tall mountains or to specially prepared anchor rocks. When the waters rise, the canoes float but do not drift away. When the waters fall, they come to rest, and the scattered survivors climb down into a scoured world. Along parts of the Atlantic coast, there are stories of a time when the sea advanced and swallowed villages, leaving only those who had fled inland or up to higher ground. In central Mexico, some Nahua traditions preserve memories of previous suns or ages, one of which ends in water. A man and a woman hide in a hollow tree or a cave and survive, but are turned into dogs or monkeys when they emerge, hinting that starting again is not simple. In the interior of North America, among some plains and eastern woodland peoples, there are earth diver myths. A flood covers everything. The creator or a culture hero floats on a raft with a few animals. One animal after another dives down into the water to retrieve a bit of mud from the submerged world. Finally, a small, unlikely creature succeeds. From that little scrap of earth, the land is rebuilt. Here the ark is not a gigantic ship, but a raft, and the repopulation is not a family having many children, but the literal reconstruction of the world's surface. If you step back from all these variations, certain structural elements keep repeating. There is almost always some kind of warning, though its timing and source vary. A god whispers in secret. A talking fish begs to be spared. The behavior of animals or the strange color of the sky alerts somebody that something is wrong. There is an ark or refuge, a boat, a chest, a raft tied to a rock, an island peak, a cave high in the mountains, a house on stilts, a hollow tree. There is a small number of chosen survivors, whether chosen by moral worth, by cleverness, by the favor of a deity, or simply by being in the right place at the right time. There are animals saved, either explicitly gathered 2 by 2, accidentally sharing the refuge, or implied in the rebirth of the animal world afterward. And there is a renewed world, often presented not as a seamless continuation, but as a different age, with new rules, new peoples, and sometimes an explicit covenant or lesson attached. Seen from the ground, none of this is mysterious. For river and coastal societies, water is the most intuitive agent of apocalypse. Rivers feed crops and carry trade, but they also jump their banks, carve new courses, and drown whole settlements overnight. Deltas sink. Storm surges push salt water far inland. Monsoon patterns wobble. In low-lying landscapes like Mesopotamia, the Indus Plains, the Nile Valley, and the great river basins of China, a really bad flood is not an abstract possibility. It is a thing you watch approach across the horizon. It stains the sky, it roars louder than speech, it carries houses and livestock and people away. If your world is flat and your horizon is close, a flood that drowns everything you can see is, in a very real sense, a flood that has drowned the world. This is part of why some scholars are cautious about the idea that all these stories must point back to a single original catastrophe. The general shape of the narrative fits the environments where it appears. In Mesopotamia, the vessel is a large barge suitable for shallow, unpredictable rivers. In Greece, it's a sealed chest tossed onto stormy seas. In India, the boat is tethered to a divine fish, fitting a culture with deep reverence for river life. In Chinese legends, the focus is less on one miraculous ship and more on state-level engineering. In mountain cultures, refuge comes as a high cave or a summit. Among seafaring islanders, the line between an ordinary canoe and an ark is thin. Any boat can be the last boat when the waves get high enough. There are also important regional differences in what the floods mean. In some traditions, the water comes as punishment for moral failure. In others, it is an impersonal disaster or the byproduct of a cosmic struggle between deities. Sometimes the survivors are rewarded and made rulers. Sometimes they are transformed, cursed, or scattered. In a few cases, there isn't really a moral at all. The flood is simply how one age ends and another begins. These differences complicate any easy claim that there was one true event encoded everywhere in exactly the same way. One way to think about it is to imagine a template, not a single story. Human groups encounter floods of many sizes, seasonal overflows, river avulsions that instantly change the course of water, rare tsunamis, occasionally the breaching of natural lakes or ice dams that really do send walls of water racing across landscapes. Every time a community survives a particularly bad one, they have reason to remember it, to build a lesson around it, to fold it into their cosmology. Given similar human psychology and similar riverine and coastal environments, it is not surprising that many of those lessons end up sharing a family resemblance. Warning, shelter, narrow survival, a cleansed world. Later, when people and stories begin to travel farther than floodwaters ever could, These locally forged narratives start interacting, borrowing, and reshaping one another. The Mesopotamian deluge and the Hebrew Ark look so similar, partly because they grew up in the same floodplain neighborhood, trading ideas as well as goods. Stories from other regions might share only the broadest outline, because they arose from independent experiences with dangerous water. Multiple floods, across millennia, can easily produce a repeating pattern, the sense that the world has ended once before and could end again beneath rising unstoppable seas. In the next part of this journey, we're going to leave the realm of text and legend for a while and look at what the Earth itself remembers. Because while myth can tell us that there was water and fear and survival, geology can tell us when and where the seas actually rose high enough to erase a coastline. When geologists talk about rising seas, they don't mean a poetic image, they mean numbers. During the last ice age, so much water was locked up in continental ice sheets that global sea level sat roughly 120 meters lower than it does today. That is not a small adjustment. That is the difference between shallow continental shelves being dry land or not. It is the difference between your fishing grounds being a day's walk from camp or 100 meters underwater. For tens of thousands of years, people lived along coastlines that no longer exist. They walked out across what we now call continental shelves, hunted and gathered on plains that modern ships sail over, built camps along rivers whose mouths were far from the current shore. Then, between about 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, as the great ice sheets melted, the ocean climbed step by step toward its present level. On average, it rose on the order of a meter every century, but that average hides violent pulses, times when meltwater from collapsing ice margins pushed the sea up much faster. From a satellite's point of view, this is a smooth, elegant change. Coastlines redraw themselves like ink spreading on paper. From the ground, it would not have felt smooth at all. You would notice that the tide seems a little higher every few years. The sandbar you played on as a child disappears beneath the waves. The freshwater spring near the beach turns brackish. The burial ground near the shore starts to erode. Ancestral places are not hit by a single crashing wave. They are eaten away season by season until one year a storm comes through and there is simply nothing left to stand on. Over a few human lifetimes, an entire seascape can be rewritten. Villages that used to be inland become coastal. Marsh turns to open water. Islands split or fuse to a community that measures time in grandparent stories, not in radiocarbon years. This is not a slow geological background process. It is something you can watch, something that makes you move, something that feels like the world itself is sliding into the sea. In some parts of the world, the changes were especially dramatic. Take Sunderland, the drowned subcontinent that once connected mainland Southeast Asia with the islands of Indonesia. At the height of the Ice Age, you could have walked from modern Vietnam all the way down to what is now Borneo and Java, across a continuous stretch of low, humid forest and broad rivers. As the ice melted, the South China Sea and the Java Sea flooded this landscape. Rich river valleys, coastal plains, whole networks of lakes and wetlands were swallowed over a period of millennia. To the people living there, each generation would have seen the shoreline creep inland. Camps and gardens that had been safe for as long as anyone remembered would end up on the wrong side of the tide line. Mangroves would invade former fields. Offshore, familiar hills would turn into islands. It doesn't take a single apocalyptic storm to feel like you're losing a world. A coastline that your grandparents call the old land, but that you will never set foot on, is already halfway to myth. On the other side of Eurasia, something similar played out in the North Sea basin. Today we talk about Doggerland, a name coined by archaeologists for the low-lying plains that once connected Britain to continental Europe. For thousands of years, this was not a cold, grey sea floor. It was dry ground, Rivers, marshes, herds of animals, bands of people moving back and forth. As the Atlantic slowly rose, those plains fragmented. First they became a patchwork of wetlands, then a scatter of islands, then an arm of the ocean. At some point, probably in the middle of this long drowning, a gigantic submarine landslide off the coast of Norway sent a series of tsunamis crashing across the region. The details are still being studied, but it looks likely that people living on the last high spots of Doggerland saw walls of water erase what remained of their home in a matter of hours. Imagine being one of their descendants, living on the now separated shores of Britain or Denmark, listening to stories of the land between the lands, the place where your people once walked to visit kin, now somewhere beneath the grey waves. It is not hard to see how that might turn into a remembered world flood, a time when the sea came in and took everything. Farther north and east, another low-lying region was changing shape. The edges of Beringia, the broad land bridge that once linked Siberia and Alaska. Much of Beringia itself was relatively high and stayed dry until quite late, but its margins were threaded with river deltas, lagoons, and shallow coastal plains. As sea level rose, those outer zones drowned first. Estuaries moved inland, coastal camps had to be abandoned. People who had once followed game or fish along a continuous coastal route found their paths cut by growing inlets and bays. And then there were the great rivers deltas closer to the equator, the Nile, the Ganges-Brahmaputra, the Mekong, the Yangtze, and many others. These are places where a small vertical rise in sea level translates into a huge horizontal shift. A metre higher ocean can push saltwater tens of kilometres upstream, ruin croplands, overwhelm natural levees, and turn once safe floodplains into dangerous shifting terrain. In such landscapes, communities are in constant negotiation with water. A few bad decades of combined sea level rise, subsidence, and storm surges can look and feel like the end of the habitable world. Each of these drowned coastlines carried more than just houses and hunting grounds. They carried story-laden landmarks, sacred groves, ancestor stones, particular bends in rivers, promontories where important things had happened. When the sea takes those away, you don't just lose real estate, you lose a map of meaning. The practical consequences are severe. Displacement, the need to find new food sources, competition with inland groups for territory. But the emotional and cultural impact is just as deep. Myths may be one way of coping with that. A narrative about an age when the sea rose up and gods or spirits remade the shoreline can function as a memory device. It explains why your people are here and not there, why the old places lie beneath the waves. It also carries a warning forward. The waters can move. The world you see is not guaranteed. At the same time, matching specific stories to specific lost coastlines is extremely hard. Sea level rise was global, but its local expression varied, and human groups everywhere have experienced floods of many kinds. A legend about a sunken fishing ground might preserve dim memories of Sunderland, or it might refer to a much later storm that took out a village a few centuries back. A tale of a land bridge that vanished could point toward Beringia, or toward a smaller local isthmus that eroded away within oral history. Archaeology is starting to map some of these drowned worlds. Sonar reveals ancient river channels under shallow seas. Cores pulled from the seabed show old soils, pollen from forests that no longer exist. In a few cases, stone tools and habitation sites have been found beneath modern waves. These traces tell us that people really were living on those vanished plains. They also remind us how much has been lost, not just in artifacts but in remembered geographies. When later generations stand on a shortened shore and look out at a horizon that used to be land, it is natural to imagine a time when the sea surged in all at once, a single great taking rather than 10,000 small bites. That imaginative compression, smoothing millennia of shoreline retreat into one dramatic encroachment, Maybe one of the ways slow geological change becomes a sudden mythic flood, the kind that feels big enough to end a world. If there is one place on the map where people have gone looking for a literal historical great flood, it is the Black Sea. In the late 20th century, a pair of oceanographers, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, were studying cores from the Black Sea floor. They noticed something striking. Layers of sediment and tiny fossils that seemed to show a switch from fresh or brackish water conditions to salty marine conditions, and that switch looked fast. They imagined a scene about 7,500 years ago when the rising Mediterranean suddenly broke through the narrow Bosporus Strait and poured into a low-lying, mostly isolated Black Sea basin that sat far below global sea level. In their reconstruction, the Black Sea before the flood was more like a huge inland lake, fringed with Neolithic villages along its shores. When the Mediterranean finally overtopped the natural barrier at the Bosporus, water would have roared in like a broken dam. They estimated that the shoreline could have advanced dozens of kilometres in a matter of months or years. Farms, houses, burial grounds, everything that people had built around that Paleolithic lake would have been drowned in a relatively short span of time. Here, they suggested, was a candidate for the kind of world-ending flood later remembered in Near Eastern literature. A real event, big enough to scatter communities, dramatic enough to echo down the centuries in story form. When this Black Sea deluge hypothesis was published in the 1990s, it captured attention far beyond geology. Headlines linked it to Noah, to Utnapishtim, to the idea that maybe at last we had found the flood. But as with most tidy answers, the details turned out to be less simple. When geologists and paleo-oceanographers began to test the hypothesis more closely, they found a more nuanced picture. There is broad agreement that during the last ice age the Black Sea basin was not the salty body of water we know today. It sat lower, fed by rivers like the Danube, Dniester and Dnieper, cut off or nearly cut off from the Mediterranean. As global sea level rose, connections between these basins changed. At some point, marine water did begin to flow in through the Bosporus. Exactly when and how fast is where the arguments begin. Some studies suggest that the key connection was established earlier than Ryan and Pittman proposed, perhaps closer to 9,000 years ago. Others argue the rise in water level within the Black Sea itself, while significant, may have happened over centuries rather than as a single catastrophic jump. Cores from different parts of the basin don't all tell the same story. The shift from fresh water to salt-tolerant organisms sometimes looks gradual, sometimes sharper, depending on where you sample. There is also the complicated question of absolute dates. Radiocarbon clocks have to be corrected for local conditions. Layers can be disturbed by later currents, burrowing organisms or slope failures. Small changes in assumptions can move a proposed sudden flood earlier or later by hundreds of years. So instead of a neat picture of a quiet lake and then a single apocalyptic inflow, what geology currently suggests is a spectrum of possibilities. At the dramatic end, there may indeed have been a period when water levels in the Black Sea rose several tens of meters relatively quickly, perhaps over decades. At the gentler end, the connection to the Mediterranean might have been more like a sustained increasing leak, punctuated by pulses of higher inflow, but never quite a Hollywood-style wall of water. Either way, if you imagine yourself as one of the Neolithic farmers along those shores, the distinction may not matter all that much. By 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, people were already cultivating crops, herding animals, building substantial houses in the lands around the Black Sea. The basin's rivers created fertile lowlands and deltas, attractive zones for early agriculture. As the basin filled and its shoreline marched upslope, those very zones would have been the first to go under. From a human perspective, losing 10 or 20 meters of vertical shoreline is not an abstract number. It means a village that was once a morning's walk from the water, gradually becoming a memory beneath the waves. It means wells turning salty, fields waterlogged, cemeteries eroding away. Families might move their houses a little inland, then a little more. Grandparents might point out over the water and say, "We used to live there." If the flooding was particularly rapid over 1 or 2 generations, the sense of crisis would have been acute. You might see relatives from downriver arrive at your settlement as refugees, their own homes drowned. You might hear rumours of other communities farther along the shore already gone. Even if no one watched a single giant wave sweep in, the cumulative effect could feel like the world's edge was collapsing. And unlike the vanished plains of Doggerland or Sunderland, the Black Sea region sat at a crossroads. To the south and east lay the early farming cultures of Anatolia and the Near East. To the west, the Balkans and Central Europe. Rivers flowing into and out of the basin were natural highways for trade, migration, and later conquest. Stories born along those changing shores did not have to stay put. A narrative about a time when the sea invaded the land could travel up the Danube with traders carrying obsidian or copper. It could cross into Anatolia with displaced families looking for new fields. It could be retold, in altered form, in villages that had never seen the Black Sea, attached now to a different river or a different coast. As centuries passed, the original geography could blur while the emotional core remained. Once, the waters rose and everything changed. Later still, as empires grew around the eastern Mediterranean, Hittite, Mycenaean, Phoenician, Greek, these local flood stories could have mingled with others. Merchants and sailors swapped tales in ports from the Aegean to the Levant. Conquerors resettled populations, bringing their gods and myths with them. Scribes shaped oral traditions into written epics, folding older memories into new theological frameworks. By the time Hebrew authors in the first millennium BCE told the story of a righteous man warned of a coming deluge, they were writing in a region where flood stories from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and perhaps even distant shores of the Black Sea had been circulating for a very long time. Whether any one of those stories was originally sparked by Neolithic shoreline change around the Black Sea is difficult to prove. The geological and chronological uncertainties make hard linkage risky. But the Black Sea case shows something important about how we think. The idea of a sudden deluge there is compelling. It offers a concrete physical mechanism, a dramatic image, a direct tie between sediments under the sea and myths in old books. That narrative is so satisfying that it can run ahead of the actual evidence, solidifying into the explanation long before the data are conclusive. Flood stories themselves work the same way. A powerful tale of waters rising, of worlds ending, of survivors starting over, does not wait for precise measurements. It moves with people, follows trade routes, crosses language boundaries. It is retold and reshaped, becoming more polished as the details of any single local flood fall away. In that sense, the Black Sea deluge is a reminder in 2 directions. First, that real landscapes do sometimes change in ways that would feel apocalyptic to the people living through them. Second, that our hunger to map those changes onto our favourite myths can outrun what the rocks and shells and radiocarbon dates can honestly tell us. The stories are fast, the evidence is slow, and in between them, memory makes its own weather. If the Black Sea case is a question mark, there are other floods in the geological record that hardly need imagination. They were real, they were enormous, and if anyone watched them from close range, the memory would have been impossible to forget. Geologists call them glacial lake outburst floods. The phrase sounds technical, a little dry, but what it hides is violence on a scale that's hard to picture. In an Ice Age landscape, glaciers don't just sit there. They move, they dam rivers, they block valleys. Meltwater pools against their walls, forming lakes held back not by rock but by ice and loose debris. As long as the dam holds, the lake rises. It can stretch hundreds of kilometers, fill entire basins, grow to volumes comparable to modern inland seas. Then, at some point, something gives. Maybe the ice thins and starts to float. Maybe water finds a crack and begins to tunnel underneath. Maybe an earthquake shakes the moraine, or a warm spell sends more meltwater than the system can handle. Whatever the trigger, once a pathway opens, the stored water doesn't trickle out. It surges. Outburst floods don't behave like ordinary rivers in flood stage. They behave more like a dam failure multiplied by 10 or 100. Discharges aren't measured in cubic meters per second the way hydrologists talk about normal rivers. They're multiplied into millions. Whole valleys fill wall to wall with fast-moving water, laden with boulders, ice blocks, uprooted trees, and grinding sand. One of the clearest examples we have is in the American Pacific Northwest, the Missoula floods. During the last ice age, a lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet pushed down into what is now northern Idaho, blocking the Clark Fork River. Behind that ice dam, water backed up into western Montana, creating a lake the size of a small sea. Glacial Lake Missoula filled and refilled many times to depths of hundreds of meters, lapping against mountain slopes high above today's towns. Every so often the dam failed. When it did, a wall of water thousands of feet high rushed out, racing westward across what is now eastern Washington at highway speeds. Estimates vary, but peak discharges may have rivaled all the rivers on Earth combined. The flood didn't just overflow banks, it tore away soil, carved new channels, plucked boulders the size of houses out of the ground, and carried them dozens of kilometers. The landscape it left behind is still there, written in stone on a scale that's visible from the air. Wide, flat-bottomed channels called coulees cut deep into basalt. Dry cataracts, fossil waterfalls, hundreds of meters wide and tall, where no river flows today. Fields of strange, hummocky hills form from dumped debris, thin soils stripped down to bedrock. There's even a kind of ripple bed, but blown up to inhuman size, undulating waves in the ground, each ripple as tall as a building and spaced hundreds of meters apart, formed by mega currents in those brief, furious days when the water roared through. When geologist J. Harlan Bretz first proposed in the 1920s that this region, now called the Channeled Scablands, had been shaped by gigantic floods, many of his colleagues resisted. The idea seemed too catastrophic, too close to myth. But the landforms wouldn't go away. Over decades, with better mapping and the discovery of Lake Missoula's former shorelines, the case for repeated megafloods became overwhelming. Missoula is just one. Across Eurasia and Central Asia there are other candidates, some equally large, others even bigger. As the great ice sheets of the last glacial period waxed and waned, they dammed and released vast lakes along their margins. North of the Black and Caspian Seas, in the basins of the Ob and Yenisei, in the Altai Mountains of Siberia and Mongolia, geomorphologists have mapped features that look suspiciously flood-borne. Giant scour marks, streamlined hills, high-elevation shorelines with no modern lakes to explain them. In Central Asia's Issyk-Kul and around the Aral and Caspian, shifting connections between basins may have produced sudden rises and falls in water level, periodically drowning lowlands, and then stranding former shorelines high and dry. In the Altai in particular, there is evidence for glacial lakes impounded by valley glaciers that, when they failed, would have sent torrents into the lowlands of western Siberia and Kazakhstan. Some reconstructions suggest floods broadly comparable to or larger than the Missoula events, though the details, exact timing, frequency, routes, are still being worked out. Farther west, along the margins of the European ice sheets, meltwater lakes formed in front of the ice from Britain to the Baltic. Occasionally these too seem to have overtopped their sills or burst through ridges, sending pulses of fresh water abruptly into the North Atlantic. Oceanographers have linked some of these pulses to Heinrich events, brief episodes of massive iceberg discharge and climate disruption, but tying any one flood to any single story is another matter, and that's the challenge. The rocks tell us there were enormous outbursts. The dates we can assign using radiocarbon luminescence or cosmogenic nuclids are often smeared across centuries or longer. Human myths, by contrast, exist in a time framework of remembered generations and named ancestors. Bridging those scales is difficult. Did people actually witness some of these floods? For Missoula's biggest ones, probably not. They seem to predate the arrival of humans in the region. But in Eurasia and Asia, especially toward the end of the last ice age, it is entirely plausible that communities lived downstream of glacial lakes that occasionally failed. What would it feel like to be in the path of such a release? You wouldn't see a neat blue wall of water like a special effect. You'd hear it first, a deep continuous thunder, as if the earth itself were grinding. The air would vibrate. Birds would take off in flocks long before you understood why. Then a dark line on the horizon, not crisp like a wave crest, but a heaving, moving front of foam and debris. The water would be brown or grey, choked with mud. Visibility would drop as mist and spray filled the air. Trees, animals, pieces of houses would tumble in the current, stripped into anonymity. If you were close, there would be no time. If you were far enough and high enough to survive, you might watch familiar landmarks vanish in minutes. Riverbanks eaten away, fields scoured, bends straightened. The flood would pass in a matter of hours or days, but when the noise faded, the world downstream wouldn't come back to what it was. Channels would be deeper, straighter, or shifted entirely. Old fords and crossings gone, fishing spots buried. The soil itself might be stripped, leaving raw gravel where crops once grew. Or, conversely, new layers of silt might bury everything to the height of a person. Dead animals, and possibly people, would lie tangled in piles of driftwood. In that sense, for the survivors, the world ended would not be metaphorical. The specific world they knew, the arrangement of paths, streams, fields, and sacred places that structured their lives, would have been erased and replaced in a single season. The planet, of course, kept spinning. Forests would recolonize bare ground. Rivers would cut new meanders into their freshly carved channels. Within a few generations, children might grow up seeing the post-flood landscape as normal, while their grandparents shook their heads and spoke of how things used to be. But the psychological fracture would be real. A time before, a time after. A sense that water, which had always been both friend and threat, could suddenly turn and rewrite everything. When those elders told their stories, they might not speak of glacial hydraulics or ice dam stability. They would speak of a day when the river roared like the sky, when stones moved like cattle, when the lowlands vanished and people climbed desperately for higher ground. They would say with simple accuracy that in those days the world was destroyed. And as those stories travelled, they would lose their local place names and technical causes, but they would keep that core, that once, without warning, the waters rose and the shape of life itself changed forever. Water isn't the only thing that can end the world. If you listen to the oldest stories people tell about catastrophe, there's another family of images that keep showing up no matter where you look. The sky catching fire, the sun turning cruel and hard, sparks or stones falling from above, ash or dust that covers everything, turning noon into twilight. Sometimes it's described as a rain of embers, sometimes as a burning wind that strips the skin, sometimes as a darkness that comes at midday and doesn't lift. You don't need an asteroid impact to get scenes like that. The Earth has its own ways of throwing fire into the sky. Volcanoes don't explode very often on human timescales, but when they do, the effects can be so abrupt and so overwhelming that for the people nearby, it doesn't just feel like a bad year or a bad generation. It feels like the fabric of the world has torn. Most of us are used to the tame version of volcanism, the slow, glowing lava pouring down the flanks of Hawaiian islands, something you can stand at a safe distance and admire. But a certain class of eruptions behaves very differently. In those, the danger isn't just molten rock. It's what happens when gas-rich magma meets groundwater, or when a dense cap of old rock holds back pressure until it fails all at once. The eruption column punches into the sky, a tower of ash and gas and shattered stone rising tens of kilometers in minutes. The upper parts of that column spread sideways, forming the familiar umbrella shape. The lower parts collapse. When they do, they race outward as pyroclastic flows. That phrase sounds like jargon, but behind it is one of the most lethal phenomena on the planet. Clouds of hot gas, ash and rock fragments, denser than air, tumbling downslope at highway speeds or more. They hug the ground, pour over ridges, fill valleys. Temperatures inside them can reach hundreds of degrees Celsius. They don't burn things so much as flash cook them. There's almost no escape if you're in their path. We know this not just from modern footage, but from the frozen moments these flows have left behind. At Pompeii and Herculaneum, on the Bay of Naples, the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE turned thriving Roman towns into time capsules. People died where they fell. Some choked on ash as roofs collapsed. Many more were caught in pyroclastic surges, their bodies later leaving voids in the hardened ash that archaeologists have cast in plaster. Before that day, Vesuvius had not erupted for centuries. Locals farmed its slopes, drank its wines, built villas with sea views. It was a backdrop, not a threat. Then, over less than 2 days, everything changed. Eyewitness accounts describe a column rising like a pine tree spreading at the top. Pumice falling so thickly it had to be shoveled away from doorways. Darkness at noon, lit only by lightning in the ash cloud. Roofs collapsing under the weight of fallout. Finally, waves of scalding gas and ash rolling down the mountain across the bay. The physical footprint of that eruption was regional. Towns on the opposite side of the volcano survived. Life went on in Rome. But for anyone within a few tens of kilometers, the catastrophe was absolute. Their city, their river, their fields, their entire social world vanished under meters of ash. In later retellings, how would you describe that if you didn't have geology? You might say that fire came from the mountain and the sky, that stones fell like rain, that day turned to night and the sun disappeared. You might say that the gods closed the heavens and buried the land. Thera, modern Santorini, offers another example, probably even closer to the core of some myths. Sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE, the volcano at the heart of that Aegean island erupted in one of the largest events of the last few tens of thousands of years. The exact date is debated, the details are still being refined, but the broad outlines are clear. The centre of the island blew out. Ash rose high into the atmosphere and spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Pumice rafts floated for weeks. Pyroclastic flows slammed into the sea, sending waves radiating outward. On the island itself, prosperous Minoan-style towns vanished under layers of tephra. If you sailed those waters, it would have been surreal. The sun dimmed by a grey veil, ash falling softly onto the deck, the sea scattered with floating stone, distant coasts losing their familiar outlines behind a curtain of dust. In Crete and along other nearby shores, the ash layer is thinner, but it's still there in cores and sediments, enough perhaps to whiten fields, poison grazing, clog cisterns, enough to give you mornings when you woke to an orange, distorted sun behind a haze that made your eyes sting. Later traditions from around the Mediterranean and Near East speak of cities punished by fire from heaven, of pillars of smoke, of days when the sun failed. it's tempting to pin specific myths, Atlantis for example, directly onto Thera. The evidence doesn't let us be that precise, but it's not hard to see how repeated encounters with ashfall and distant eruptions could have stocked the human imagination with images of burning skies and buried towns. Ash does strange things to light. When a volcano injects fine particles high into the stratosphere, they can circle the globe, scattering sunlight. At ground level, the effect is unsettling. Midday becomes a muted yellowish twilight. Sunsets turn lurid red, then brown. Shadows soften and lengthen. Sometimes for days or weeks, you can look directly at the sun without squinting, because its rays are being filtered by a thin, dusty veil. People who live through eruptions in Iceland, Indonesia, Japan, and Central America have all described that same sense, that the sun had changed, that its face was masked, that the sky itself had thickened or come down closer to the earth. If you're inclined to think in mythic terms, you might say that the heavens had closed, or that the sun had grown weak, or that smoke from the underworld had risen to choke the day. And again, the scale of the experience is tricky. A major eruption can darken skies and dust landscapes over regions the size of countries. A super eruption, like the ones recorded at Toba or Taupo in deeper prehistory, can send sulfur and ash high enough to cool global climate for a few years, but those are rare. Most of the fire from the sky experiences people actually lived through were local or regional. For the farmer whose crops fail because ash has smothered them, or the fisherman whose harbour is choked by floating pumice. It doesn't matter that far away other people are enjoying clear blue days. Their world has ended, their city is under ash, their sky has turned strange. So when we hear stories about the sun turning to darkness, or embers raining from above, or gods hurling fire that buries towns, we don't have to imagine a single global apocalypse that everyone on Earth experienced together. We can imagine instead a patchwork of volcanic disasters scattered across time and space. Each one felt by its victims as the end of everything. Each one leaving behind a layer in the rocks, a ring in the trees, and a memory in the minds of survivors. That the ground itself can open, that the sky can burn, and that in a single bad season a whole city can be here, and then gone, entombed in ash as if it had never been. Fire in the sky is dramatic. It's the kind of thing that sears itself into memory in an instant. But there's another kind of catastrophe that works more slowly. No collapsing roofs, no glowing clouds, no single day when everything changes. Just a creeping failure of the seasons. A year when summer never really arrives. When the leaves come late, the frosts come early, and the harvest comes up thin. In the language of geology and climate science, this has a name, a volcanic winter. When a big eruption punches material all the way into the stratosphere, it doesn't just send up ash, it also injects sulfur-rich gases. Up there, where rain can't easily wash things out, those gases react with water vapour and form a delicate haze of sulfate aerosols, tiny droplets that linger for months to years. Each one is a speck of mirror. They scatter and reflect incoming sunlight back into space. Not enough to plunge the world into darkness, but enough to shave a degree or so off global temperatures, sometimes more at higher latitudes. Enough to shorten growing seasons, to shift rainfall patterns, to turn what should have been a warm, wet summer into something grey and grudging. To someone living close to subsistence, that difference is enormous. You sow your fields as usual. Spring feels a bit slow to start, but that happens. Then the days that should be bright stay clouded and cold. The wind is out of the wrong quarter. Buds don't swell. Grain that should be knee-high in June barely reaches your ankle. The fruit trees are stingy with blossom, and then, just when you'd expect the generous, fattening weeks of late summer, there's a chill in the mornings again. A frost comes that shouldn't. The ears of grain are small, the tubers undersized. You bring in what you can, but you can see, even as you pile it up, that the numbers don't work. The first historical case people usually think of is 1816, the year without a summer, in the wake of the Tambora eruption in Indonesia the year before. Tambora's plume lofted so much sulfur into the stratosphere that, for a couple of years, the world's climate was measurably cooler. In Europe and North America, observers reported June snow, frozen lakes in May, crop failures, and strangely coloured sunsets. In New England, farmers watched their seedlings wither under repeated cold snaps. Some simply gave up and left, joining the first big waves of migration into the American Midwest. This wasn't just a weather curiosity, it meant hunger. Grain prices spiked. People rioted at markets. Families that had been clinging to the edge found there was no edge left to cling to. Go back further and you find other candidates. In 1258, chronicles from England, France, Iraq and China all record a mysterious cold, dim year with failed harvests, pestilence, and repeatedly phrases like, "the sun was weakened," or "the air was thick." Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show a huge spike in volcanic sulfate around the same time, probably from a massive tropical eruption we still haven't definitively located on the map. In 536 and 540 CE, writers in the Mediterranean and Near East describe a year without dawn, a sun that gave no more light than the moon, summers that felt like winter. Tree rings from Europe and Asia show stunted growth. Volcanic markers hint at one or more large eruptions. Those cold years sit at the beginning of what some historians call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that coincides with plagues, migrations, and political upheaval across Eurasia. To people living through those episodes, the pattern would be brutally simple. The sky goes strange, the light turns thin and sickly, the warm months don't behave, then hunger arrives. With hunger comes movement. Families abandoning marginal land and heading toward river valleys and cities, pastoralists pushing into farming zones, refugees knocking at already strained gates, and wherever desperate people collide over limited food, conflict follows. How do you explain that if you don't have stratospheric aerosol chemistry? You might say that heaven had turned its face away, that someone somewhere had offended the gods and the sun was refusing to shine in protest. That smoke or dust from the underworld had risen to dim the day, that the great clockwork of the seasons, normally so reliable, had slipped a tooth. In a lot of mythic traditions, that's exactly what we see. Not just floods, not just fire, but stories of long darkness and biting cold. Tales where the sun was stolen, or the world tree stopped bearing leaves, or 3 winters came with no summer between. In Norse myth, the prelude to the final battle, Ragnarok, includes a Fimbul winter, an immense, unending winter that breaks human society before the gods themselves fall. In parts of the Andes, there are stories of a time when the sun vanished for days and frost killed the crops on every terrace. In Mesoamerica, some Maya texts speak of failed maize, of a sun that did not rise well as part of cosmic upheaval. It doesn't have to be literally sunless for those phrases to make sense. A few bad years in a row, cold, wet summers, failed harvests, frosts in the wrong months, are enough. Over generations, the concrete details blur. Nobody remembers that it was 3 seasons or 7, or that the first cold year came after strange sunsets. What remains is the emotional core, the fear that the dependable warmth might stop, the knowledge that if the summer fails, everything else comes apart. That's why darkness and cold so often sit beside flood and fire in the world's catalogue of disasters. Too much water kills you, too little warmth kills you, too much sky fire kills you. They're all ways the normal life-supporting balance can tip into something hostile. Trying to line those myths up with specific eruptions is extremely difficult, We can date ice layers, we can match tree ring anomalies to known volcanoes, but oral traditions don't come with timestamps. A story recorded in the 19th century might be a few generations old, or it might carry fragments of memory from centuries back, layered with later additions, reinterpreted, re-ritualized, retold in new political and religious contexts. So when we hear about years without summer, about endless winters and stolen suns, we can't say, that's definitely 536, or that must be Tambora seen from the other side of the world. What we can say is that human beings everywhere have known what it is to watch the seasons fail, to see the sky change in a way they can't control and don't understand, and to feel the slow disaster of hunger unrolling over months instead of minutes. That experience leaves marks in ice and in tree rings. It also leaves marks in stories, in prayers asking the sun to return, in rituals meant to coax back the warmth. The physical traces tell us when the world cooled. The myths tell us what it felt like when it did. For most people in most times, the ground is the one thing you can trust. The sky can go dark, the rains can fail, the rivers can flood, but the earth under your feet feels solid, dependable, uninterested in human drama. You build your houses on it, you bury your dead in it. You tell yourself, without ever quite saying it aloud, that at least this won't move, so when it does, the shock goes deeper than the cracks in the walls. Around the rim of the Pacific, along the coasts of Japan, Chile, Cascadia, Alaska, across the islands of Indonesia and the Philippines, through Greece, Italy, Turkey, Iran, all the way down the spine of the Himalaya, you see a pattern in traditional stories. There are tales of the earth buckling like a living thing, of mountains that rise in a single night, of whole villages swallowed, of seas that withdraw and then roar back as walls of water, of islands that tilt so that the old harbour is suddenly a hill and the old fields lie below the tide. To a geologist with a map of plate boundaries, that clustering makes sense. Earthquakes and tsunamis are not evenly sprinkled across the globe. They happen most where the great plates of the planet's crust grind past, collide, or dive beneath each other. Subduction zones transform faults, collision belts, the machinery of plate tectonics. To the people who lived on those margins for thousands of years, that machinery showed up not as lines on a diagram, but as days when the world went strange. An earthquake is, in one sense, simple. Locked plates snap past each other, energy stored for decades or centuries is released in seconds and the ground shakes. But for a culture that has never seen a seismograph, it feels like something else entirely. The earth shivers and lurches, houses sway, then leap sideways. The noise, low, grinding like a gigantic beast waking up under the foundations. Hills slump, cliffs peel away, rivers slosh out of their beds. It's not hard to see why so many traditions imagine great serpents or dragons under the land, or titans chained in the deep, or gods who occasionally shift their shoulders. Something immense, restless, only barely held in place. And then there are the waves. A large undersea earthquake, or a submarine landslide that it triggers, can displace a vast volume of water. Out in the deep ocean, the resulting tsunami is almost invisible, a long, low swell racing faster than an airplane. Only when it hits shallower coastal shelves does it rear up, slow down, and turn into something humans can see and fear. What makes tsunamis so confusing and so memorable is that they break the usual pattern. Most floods come with rain. The sky darkens, clouds pile up, you can hear the water arrive, rivers swell over hours or days, even a storm surge rides in on the back of a visible storm. Tsunamis can arrive under a clear blue sky. Sometimes, especially near the source, the first sign isn't a wave at all, but the opposite of a wave. The sea pulls back, exposing the seafloor, stranding fish, revealing rocks that have never been dry in living memory. Curious people walk out onto the shining mud. Then the horizon rises. By the time you understand what you're seeing, it's too late to run. When survivors tell that story, what phrase can they possibly use except a flood that came from the sea, a flood without rain, the sea climbed the land? That language shows up again and again. In Japan, legends along the Sanriku coast describe earthquake waves and tell of seawater rushing far inland on perfectly clear days. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous nations remember a night when the ground shook so hard that people could not stand, and soon after that, a massive wave that drowned coastal forests and canoes tied high above the usual tide. Those oral histories line up strikingly with geological traces: drowned tree stumps in intertidal zones, sheets of ocean sand laid down across marshes, sudden drops in coastal elevation recorded in buried soils. In Cascadia, for example, radiocarbon dates on ghost forests and Japanese records of an orphan tsunami with no local earthquake point toward a major subduction quake in the early 1700s. The stories don't give us a day and hour. They do preserve the sequence: shaking, then the sea. Sometimes the ground doesn't need to shake violently to change a coastline. Along tectonic margins, land is slowly warped by the grinding of plates. It can be lifted up, building marine terraces, or it can subside, sinking relative to sea level. Most of the time, that movement is glacially slow, but earthquakes can release decades of that strain in a moment. A strip of coast might suddenly drop a meter or two. In satellite data, that's a small shift. In lived experience, it's catastrophic. Your fields, once safely above the tide, are now salty marsh. The cemetery where your grandparents lie floods twice a day. The house posts, which used to stand on dry ground, are now in the water. To a community, it feels as if the sea has risen overnight to claim what was promised to the land. The opposite can happen too. A quake can jerk a coastline upward, stranding old shorelines meters above the modern waves. Sheltered bays become useless as harbours. The reef where your people have always fished is now a jagged shelf drying in the sun. In both cases you can imagine the story that follows. The world shifted. The gods were angered. The sea came where it should not, or fled where it should stay. People moved inland or along the coast to find a new anchorage. Ancestors were left behind in drowned graves or abandoned shrines. These are not speculative emotions. They're exactly what people living through recorded events have described. After the 1964 Alaskan earthquake, some coastal villages found their familiar low tide lines permanently underwater. After the 2011 Tohoku quake in Japan, parts of the coastline dropped, so that seawalls that had once loomed above the waves suddenly sat at water level. Over centuries, as the immediate details of dates and place names erode, what lingers in memory is the sense that once the sea came higher, or, in the old days, the land was lower. Those ideas get braided into flood myths, etiological tales about why certain rocks or trees mark boundaries, why a particular hill is sacred. It was where the waters stopped. Geologists sometimes point to specific cases where a story and strata seem to meet. A Maori tradition in New Zealand speaks of a chief whose chanting split the land and sent the sea rushing in. Nearby, there are clear signs of prehistoric subsidence and tsunami deposits. Indigenous accounts from Chile's coast remember a night of shaking followed by a devouring wave. The region is one of the most active subduction zones on Earth, with known past megaquakes. It's tempting to match each legend to a line on a seismograph, but the caution from earlier sections applies here too. Oral traditions layer. A single narrative can weave together several events: the big wave, a later landslide, a separate fire, into one coherent story. And a single event can splinter into many different tales. Imagine standing on a coast during a great subduction earthquake. The ground heaves, cliffs collapse, sending up plumes of dust that briefly darken the sky. Fires break out in fallen houses. Somewhere offshore, the seafloor lurches, and an hour later the tsunami arrives. One community struck hardest by the shaking remembers the day the earth took our homes, and tells stories of mountains that walked. Another, farther inland but along the river, remembers only the wall of water surging upstream under an empty sky, and preserves that as a rainless flood. A fishing village that mostly escapes the wave but sees the fires on the horizon and breathes the dust may pass down stories of a darkened sun and flames along the shore. Wave, darkness, fire, exile. Different fragments of the same underlying catastrophe, filtered through who happened to survive, what they saw, and which detail their grandchildren found most meaningful. Over thousands of years, those fragments can drift apart entirely. One becomes a flood myth. One becomes a tale about a dragon in the mountain. One turns into a ritual that prohibits building too close to the shore, because once the sea was angry here. The original earthquake vanishes from explicit memory, but its fingerprints remain, faintly, in culture. When we look at those stories from a distance, it can be tempting to search for the one true event behind them all, some primordial great quake, or world tsunami that explains every tale of shaking earth and rising sea. The geological record doesn't really support that idea. Instead, it shows many regional catastrophes, scattered across time and space, each enormous from the local human point of view, each capable of seeding a cluster of myths. What they share is not a single origin, but a shared lesson. The ground is not as solid as it seems, the sea is not as tame as it looks, and the world we build our lives on can, under the right kind of pressure, move. If earthquakes and tsunamis make you doubt the ground and the sea, impacts make you doubt the sky itself. Most nights, the heavens feel comfortably far away. Stars are fixed points. The moon glides along a familiar path. Even when you notice a bright meteor, it's a momentary streak, gone before you've finished your thought. Beautiful, but harmless. Now imagine the night when it isn't harmless. You're outside by a fire. The sky is clear. Then, without warning, a second sun appears. It's brighter than anything you've ever seen. Shadows snap into place on the wrong side of every object. The light has a strange colour, white, blue, and painful to look at. Birds explode out of the trees in panic. Dogs howl. For a few heartbeats you think dawn has arrived in the middle of the night. Then the sky begins to burn. A fiery object too bright to stare at tears across the heavens. It leaves a glowing trail that hangs there, boiling, like a wound in the firmament. It vanishes behind the hills. A few seconds pass, maybe a minute, and then the air hits. The shock wave arrives as a wall of wind. Trees bow, then snap. Roofs lift. Windows shatter inward. People are thrown to the ground. A sound like continuous thunder roars across the landscape, except it's sharper, closer, inside your chest. In that moment, it would be perfectly reasonable to think that the world is ending. Events like that have happened within the span of human memory, if not always within written records. In 1908, over Siberia, something, probably a small asteroid or comet fragment, detonated high in the atmosphere above the Tunguska River. No crater, but an immense airburst. The blast flattened trees across more than 2,000 square kilometres. People hundreds of kilometres away reported a sky that split in two, a flash, and a wave of heat like an open furnace. Scale that experience down or up, shift it back 10,000 years, and you can begin to imagine how ancient communities might have told the story. A piece of the sky fell. The heavens were angry. Fire came from above without warning. Once you've lived through that, The ordinary shooting stars you see on calm nights are no longer neutral scenery. They are reminders, they become signs. That may be part of why so many cultures treat comets and meteors as omens. In China, in Babylon, in Mesoamerica, in Greece and Rome, sudden bright objects in the sky are rarely recorded as casual curiosities. They come tied to dynastic changes, deaths of kings, famines, plagues, wars. Even if the association is often coincidence, the pattern of thought makes a certain emotional sense. If something can fall from the perfect distant sky and bring disaster once, it might do so again. Better to treat every unusual visitor as a warning. Over generations, that instinct hardens into symbolism. Comets are spears, torches, dragons. Meteors are arrows from the gods, heavenly stones hurled in anger. Stories imagine battles in the sky, or celestial courts sending punishments down onto an unworthy earth. Occasionally, the stories also remember the physical details in ways that make scientists pay attention. There are myths in North America, for example, that talk about stars that fell and set forests on fire, or a sky serpent whose tail burned the land. Some indigenous traditions in Australia describe a fiery star that brought a great wind and destroyed trees. Those phrases echo some of what witnesses described at Tunguska: fire, wind, flattened forests, no obvious crater. Because of those parallels, some researchers have proposed that prehistoric airbursts could lie behind clusters of skyfire stories. Not a single planet-wide catastrophe, but scattered regional blows. Small comets or stony asteroids exploding at altitude over vulnerable landscapes, starting fires, killing game, terrifying survivors. This is where the much-discussed Younger Dryas impact hypothesis comes in. Around 12,800 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the climate in the northern hemisphere abruptly flipped back to cold conditions for more than 1,000 years. At the same time, many large animals in North America and elsewhere went extinct, and human cultures were forced to adapt to new environments. A group of scientists has suggested that one trigger for this abrupt shift might have been a fragmented comet or asteroid breaking up in the atmosphere over the ice sheets or continents, causing multiple airbursts and surface impacts. They point to layers of unusual materials, tiny glassy spherules, magnetic grains, elevated platinum levels, charcoal, that appear in some archaeological and geological sites near the start of the Younger Dryas. If that scenario were true, it would give an obvious candidate for apocalyptic stories. A rain of fire across continents, sudden burning, a cold snap that followed. But the evidence is controversial. Other researchers argue that many of those supposed impact markers can be produced by ordinary processes: wildfires, volcanic activity, slow deposition. Some sites show the signals, others don't. Radiocarbon dates are messy. There is so far no agreed-upon smoking gun, no clear crater or global layer like the one associated with the dinosaur-killing impact 66 million years ago. So the Younger Dryas impact idea remains debated. Intriguing to some, unconvincing to others, still very much a hypothesis rather than a settled explanation. What doesn't require a global catastrophe, though, is the link between rare, spectacular sky events and stubborn, long-lived stories. Even a single regional airburst, seen by a few thousand people in one valley, could seed narratives that travel far beyond the blast zone. A family flees the fires and resettles downstream, telling their children about the star that exploded and the wind that pulled up the trees. Those children marry into another group and share the tale around a different fire. Over centuries, the details blur and merge with other disasters, droughts, wars, volcanic ash. But the core image persists. Once, the sky burned and we were punished or spared. Because impacts and bright comets are rare on human timescales, they don't get normalized by repetition. There's no just another impact season to dilute their power. A culture might experience something like Tunguska only once in tens of thousands of years. That kind of uniqueness makes it sacred story material. It wants explanation. It demands meaning. So comets become messengers. Meteors become judgments. The night sky, once a calm ceiling, acquires a potential for sudden violence. And somewhere, beneath all the layers of symbolism and morality, there may linger a memory of the night when a second sun rose, the air turned to fire, and people realized that even the heavens can fall. By the time we reach the end of the last ice age, all of these fears of water, fire, shaking ground, and a treacherous sky are waiting like seeds in the human imagination. And then the climate itself starts to swing. From about 20,000 years ago onward, the planet is coming out of its deep freeze. But it doesn't do this slowly and politely. It lurches. Temperatures climb, then crash, then soar again. Sheets of ice the size of continents begin to melt, sending floods of cold fresh water into the oceans, which in turn jolt the climate system into new configurations. If you were living through it, you wouldn't experience global climate change as a smooth curve on a graph. You'd experience it as a series of broken promises, winters that used to be predictably brutal becoming strangely mild, then, without warning, returning with a vengeance. Summers that grow longer and wetter for a few generations, filling valleys with grass and game, only to flip to hot and dry, turning that same valley into a dust bowl your grandchildren can't farm. Rivers changing course within a lifetime. Glaciers that had loomed on the horizon for as long as anyone could remember suddenly retreating, leaving behind raw, unstable landscapes of boulders, lakes, and braided streams. One of the sharpest of these lurches is the Younger Dryas, that 1,000-odd-year cold relapse we just touched on. For people in the Northern Hemisphere, it might have felt like the climate breaking its word. The world was warming, ice was melting, plants and animals were returning to lands that had been barren for millennia. Then, over the span of a few decades, or perhaps even less, the trend reversed. Colder, drier, stormier. Forests stalled or died back, grasslands shifted, herd animals migrated or declined. You don't need a single day of doom when the seasons themselves become unreliable. In many places the familiar ways of life would have collapsed, not because people forgot how to live, but because the rules changed faster than knowledge could keep up. A hunting strategy that had worked for countless generations might fail when herds no longer follow old migration paths. A favoured fishing ground might vanish under rising seas, or be cut off by new sandbars and inlets. Plants your grandparents relied on might retreat upslope or disappear entirely. In that kind of world, every decision becomes a gamble. Do you stay put and hope the old patterns return? Or do you move, abandoning ancestral camps and sacred places to chase rumours of better land over the horizon? Layered on top of this were the animals themselves. For most of the Pleistocene, humans share their world with creatures that, to us, feel almost mythological. Woolly mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of small trucks, saber-toothed cats, enormous bison, towering elk with antlers wider than a car is long. In Australia there are giant wombat-like diprotodons. In the Americas, armoured glyptodons with shells like living boulders. Between about 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, a huge share of these megafauna disappear. The timing varies by continent and species, and researchers still debate the exact mix of causes: shifting climate, shrinking habitats, human hunting pressure, perhaps new diseases. But the pattern is clear. Large animals that had been stable parts of ecosystems for hundreds of thousands of years vanish within windows that are abrupt on evolutionary and sometimes on cultural timescales. Imagine being in one of the last human communities that still sees mammoths regularly. Your people have names for them. taboos around hunting them, stories about how your ancestors learned to read their tracks, songs about the first time one was brought down. Then, over a few human lifetimes, the herds thin. Calves are rare. Old trails grow over. Eventually no one young has seen a mammoth alive. Only the elders remember. How do you explain that absence? One way is ecological reasoning. The weather changed, the grass changed, the animals followed the cold northward. But it's just as likely the story becomes moral. We hunted too many. We broke a rule. The spirits of the animals withdrew from us. Or cosmological. Once, there were great beasts, and a catastrophe came. Flood, fire, ice storm, and took them away. Loss on that scale practically demands a story large enough to match it. It's also important that none of this happens all at once, everywhere. The end of the Ice Age is not a single synchronized curtain drop. It's more like a staggered, overlapping series of acts in different theatres. In some regions, ice sheets retreat early, opening up new lands that fill with tundra and then forest. In others, glaciers linger, feeding outburst floods and cold winds long after nearby areas have greened. Sea level rises steadily on average, but locally it can jump in pulses when an ice dam fails, and a proglacial lake drains into the ocean. One coastline might notice the water creeping higher over centuries. Another might experience a more sudden rearrangement of bays, islands, and river mouths. The same is true for extinctions. Giant marsupials in Australia are gone tens of thousands of years before mammoths in Siberia. North American megafauna crash around the end of the Pleistocene, while some large animals in Africa persist, albeit in reduced ranges. What reads to us, in hindsight, as an extinction event is, on the ground, a patchwork of local disappearances, near misses and last refuges. For human communities, that means catastrophe arrives not as one universal apocalypse, but as a sequence of regional shocks. A group in what is now the Middle East might remember the time the rains failed for many years, turning pasture into salt flats. Another, in what is now Southeast Asia, might remember the sea advancing into their river valley, swallowing fishing camps and mangrove forests. A third, in the far north, might remember the winter the familiar herds never returned, and strange new animals appeared from the south. Over generations, those experiences are folded into tradition. Some become tales of gradual change, journeys, migrations, the search for new hunting grounds. Others are compressed into single episodes. The year the ice broke, the night the sea climbed the cliffs, the season when all the great beasts died. When later societies tell stories about a great flood, or an age when giants walked the earth and then were destroyed, or a time when winter swallowed the world, they may not be pointing back to a single afternoon when everything ended. They may be distilling thousands of years of climatic whiplash, ecological loss, and forced adaptation into a narrative that can be carried in memory. There was an old world, it passed away, and we live in what came after. And as those stories travel, across valleys, across continents, they begin to meet other stories born from different shocks in different places. That's where the next part of our journey takes us, into the ways tales of disaster can wander farther and last longer than the people who first lived them. By the time we reach the Holocene, the relatively stable, warm slice of time we still live in, people aren't just adapting to new landscapes, they're adapting to each other. Trade routes begin as simple paths, one band walking to another band to swap stone, shells, hides, maybe marriage partners. But over centuries those paths become chains, and the chains become networks. Obsidian from one volcanic outcrop shows up hundreds of miles away. Seashells from the coast are found deep inland. Copper, jade, lapis, glass, silk. As time goes on, different materials take their turn as the weird, beautiful thing from far away that everyone wants. Whenever objects move like that, stories move with them. A trader doesn't just hand you a tool, he tells you where it came from and what happened to his people last winter. A marriage alliance doesn't just exchange individuals, it grafts a whole new set of ancestors, taboos and origin tales onto your family tree. A raid doesn't just take food and captives, it leaves behind fragments of language, insults, oaths, and whispered explanations for why those warriors were so angry in the first place. This is cultural diffusion in slow motion. Not a single wave, but countless tiny ripples. Motifs, phrases, characters, all drifting from group to group, being translated, misheard, simplified and embellished as they go. By the time the first cities form, along the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, this web has already been operating for thousands of years. But literacy changes its texture. Oral tradition is wonderfully flexible. A story is never exactly the same twice. It bends to the mood of the teller, the needs of the audience, the politics of the moment. That's how it stays alive. When you start writing things down, another process appears on top of that: standardization. A priesthood or a royal court can decide which version of a story gets copied, taught and performed at official festivals. They can collect scattered local tales into a single grand narrative. They can declare one god supreme, one deluge definitive, one hero the ancestor of everyone who matters. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis story, the later biblical flood narrative, these don't appear out of nowhere. They crystallize in literate empires that already sit on deep layers of older oral memories. Once they're written, they can spread fast, hitching rides on politically powerful institutions, temples, schools, imperial administrations, missionary movements. Now a flood story that may once have belonged to a narrow stretch of river can become, in a few centuries, the official explanation for why the whole world is the way it is. Underneath all the local variations, you start to see recurring building blocks. There is often a warning, from a god, a dream, an omen, an elder who remembers something similar. There is usually a righteous survivor or a small group, singled out not just for luck, but for virtue, cleverness, or obedience. And there is a reset, the old order swept away, a new one established, with fresh rules and a renewed contract between humans and the powers that govern the cosmos. You can find that pattern in flood myths, fire myths, plague myths, even tales of wandering stars that scorch the earth. Swap in different hazards, and the skeleton remains the same. Take a story about a river overflowing and erasing a farming village. Move it into a mountain valley prone to landslides, and the water from the heavens might become stones from the mountain, burying houses instead of drowning them. Carry it to a coastal community living under the threat of tsunamis, and the same moral, heed the signs, respect the spirits, don't build too close to the edge, can now be wrapped around a wall of water that arrives without rain at all. Bring that story to a fire-prone grassland, and the reset may come as a wall of flame. The year the plains burned black and only the people who followed the shaman's instructions survived. Tell it in a seismically active region, and the anger of the gods shakes the earth, swallows cities, and raises new hills where fields used to be. Sometimes you can watch this adaptation happen in historical time. A myth incorporating a specific local mountain suddenly starts appearing in communities that live nowhere near it. The name changes, the details shift, but the core narrative arc is unmistakably related. In other cases, all we see are parallel themes scattered across cultures, and we're left to wonder, is this a family resemblance or a coincidence? That's the hard part. Humans everywhere live with water, weather, fire, hunger, and grief. There are only so many ways to dramatize a flood, a famine, or an epidemic. Similar stories don't automatically mean a single origin. any more than two languages both having a word for mother, proves they come from the same homeland. At the same time, we know trade, migration, conquest, and intermarriage have been linking human groups for tens of thousands of years. It would be surprising if powerful stories didn't spread along those links, just as metals, crops, and diseases did. So we're left in a middle ground. Some myths almost certainly share a common ancestor, diffused and reshaped over millennia. Others may be genuinely independent inventions, different peoples turning to the same limited set of narrative tools to make sense of different or even similar disasters. In most cases, the evidence isn't fine-grained enough to let us choose confidently between shared origin and convergent storytelling. What we can say is that by the time literate civilizations start carving flood tales into stone and writing fiery judgments on clay tablets, they are not inventing the idea of cosmic catastrophe. They are selecting, amplifying, and codifying strands from a much older, much more fluid tapestry of memories. The same basic drama, warning, judgment, survival, reset, has already been travelling, mutating, and connecting distant communities for a very long time. And that tells us something important about the storytellers themselves, about the minds that keep returning to these apocalyptic shapes, even when the world outside isn't actually ending. When psychologists and anthropologists look at these stories, they don't just see chronicles of things that happened. They see maps of how the human mind responds when too much happens at once. Our brains are pattern-hunting machines. They evolved in a world where missing a pattern had consequences. You eat the wrong berry, you drink from the wrong pool, you ignore the wrong cloud formation, and you don't get another chance. So when something enormous and terrible happens, a flood, a fire, a famine, the mind doesn't just register water came, crops died. It asks a louder question. What does this mean? Meaning is a kind of second shelter. Build it well enough, and the chaos outside can't quite get in. One way to build it is through cause and effect. The river rose because we cut down too many trees. The mountain shook because the spirits are angry. The sickness came because we broke a taboo. From a scientific point of view, those explanations can be wildly off. From a psychological point of view, they do crucial work. They turn a random blow into something negotiable. If disaster comes because of reasons, then maybe next time, if you behave differently, it won't. Terror becomes a problem to be managed instead of a pure, helpless catastrophe. Another way to build shelter is through patterns of morality. Floods and fires in myths rarely hit at random. They arrive after greed spreads, or hospitality is refused, or sacred rules are ignored. A god warns, a messenger is mocked, an elder is not listened to. Then comes the wave, or the flame, or the long winter. These aren't just scare tactics. They're a way of teaching that the world itself has a kind of moral texture, that what people do matters at a cosmic level, that cruelty, arrogance, or forgetfulness ripple outward until the sky and sea themselves respond. Water, fire, and darkness show up in these stories again and again, not because ancient people lacked imagination, but because those were the elements most closely wrapped around survival. Water is everything, and its opposite. Too little, and you get drought, famine, and slow, grinding loss. Too much, and you get instant obliteration. Entire years of work, fields, irrigation channels, houses, granaries, can disappear in hours. You can't negotiate with a flash flood. You can only hope to read the landscape well enough to avoid the worst of it. So water becomes a perfect symbol for the boundary between safety and annihilation. It gives life generously, then takes it away without warning. A world-ending flood is the nightmare version of a truth every farming village already knows. Your fate is tied to the river, and the river does not explain itself. Fire is the opposite kind of threat. A flood erases, fire exposes. It shows you exactly how your world is being destroyed in bright, devouring detail. Grasslands, forests, wooden houses, stored grain. Everything our ancestors relied on was tinder waiting for the wrong spark in the wrong season. But fire is also protection. Warmth in winter, cooked food, metal tools, cleared fields. That double nature makes it a natural language for judgment. A god who sends fire is not using some alien substance. He's turning up the volume on something humans already use and fear every day. Darkness is simpler. Without artificial light, night is a wall. You can't see predators, you can't see enemies, you can't easily move, work, or find food. Extended darkness, from volcanic ash, heavy smoke, dust storms, long winters, takes that wall and drags it into daytime. It scrambles circadian rhythms, starves crops, and erodes the sense that tomorrow will be better than today. To say the sun went away or the sky went black is not just a poetic flourish. It is a way of saying the basic rhythm that anchors our minds, light and dark, effort and rest, stopped making sense. Under stress, brains reach for images that are already charged with emotion. So when people try to describe a disaster so big that it doesn't fit inside ordinary words, they reach for the strongest symbols they have: flooding water, devouring fire, vanishing light. These images do social work too. A story about a world-ending flood is not only about hydrology, it is about who listened, who shared food, who followed instructions, who helped neighbours onto the boat, who hoarded, who mocked, who shut their doors. After a real disaster, a community is full of fractures. Some had warning, some didn't. Some lost everything, others survived almost intact. There are resentments, guilts, questions about why this family and not that one. Myths help sand those jagged edges into a shared narrative. We all suffered because we, as a people, went astray. We survived because one righteous ancestor obeyed the sign. The gods spared us so long as we kept this ritual, this law, this boundary. That doesn't erase individual grief, but it gives everyone a place inside the story. It makes it easier to live together afterwards. Myths also explain trauma to children who didn't live through the original event. They answer the questions that hang in the air decades later. Why the old town by the shore is underwater, why the fields are full of rock instead of soil, why the elders flinch at thunder or look uneasy when the river rises. Telling those children, once the gods drowned the world because people were wicked, may feel harsh to modern ears. But for a parent trying to keep a fragile settlement alive, it's a way of saying, this is serious. These rules are not arbitrary. If you break them, it isn't only you who suffers. Everyone does. Sometimes, the end of the world in these stories is not about the planet at all. It is about the end of a specific, precious arrangement of life. For a small coastal village, the destruction of the harbour, the loss of boats and fishing grounds, can feel as final as the sun going out. For a highland community, a landslide that buries fields and graves and the old meeting place is not just dirt moving, it is the death of the only world that counts. Language holds this feeling. When people say everything changed, they rarely mean that gravity reversed and the stars fell. They mean our home is gone, our neighbours are dead, our calendar no longer matches the seasons, our gods did not protect what they were supposed to protect. The same is true in the deep past. A group forced to abandon an ancestral valley might remember it, generations later, as a time when the mountains themselves walked or the sea rose to swallow the land. They aren't necessarily trying to give a geologically accurate report. They're trying to honour the emotional scale of the loss. If you've ever stood in a place after a fire or a flood or a war and felt that nothing that mattered is left, you've tasted the same feeling. The world is still turning, but your world has ended. Seen this way, the recurrence of apocalyptic motifs across cultures isn't just an intellectual puzzle. It's a testament to shared human vulnerability. Different peoples, in different times, with different gods and languages, kept circling back to the same shapes. Rising water, cleansing fire, smothering darkness. A few survivors carrying a burden of memory into a quieter, emptier landscape. Not because they copied each other's scripts exactly, though sometimes they did, but because the human nervous system responds to catastrophe in certain recognizable ways. Shock, fear, guilt, searching for reasons, looking for patterns, telling and retelling until the story hurts less, or at least hurts in a way you can bear. When we read or listen to these myths now, it can be tempting to treat them as riddles with prizes attached. Solve the code, match the image to a specific tsunami or eruption, and you win. There is value in that detective work. It can connect narrative to sediment, legend to ice core. But beneath the urge to decode, there is another invitation, to treat these stories as acts of care. Care for the dead, whose lives are folded into a narrative instead of disappearing without trace. Care for the living, who need rules and reasons to go on. Care for the future, for the children and grandchildren who might one day face something similar and need guidance on how to survive, how to behave, how to make sense of a sky that suddenly looks hostile. If there is a single universal in apocalypse stories, it may not be water or fire or darkness at all. It may be that quiet determination, after the worst has happened, to gather the survivors, sit them in a circle and say, "Listen, this is what we went through. This is what we think it meant. This is how, somehow, we are still here." And that, more than any particular detail about how high the water rose or how long the ash fell, is the memory that endures. So where does all of this leave us? We have flood myths, fire myths, darkness myths, earth-shaking myths, spread across continents and languages and millennia. We have shorelines that used to be dry land, valleys that used to be lakes, ash layers that turn up in ice 1,000 miles from the volcano that made them. We have brains that reach for the same images when they are frightened enough. There are a few big families of explanation, and they don't have to cancel each other out. One is the many small worlds ending idea. In this view, almost every culture accumulates stories of disaster because almost every culture, sooner or later, sees its own version of the end. A river shifts its course, a glacier dam bursts, a hillside comes down in the night. For the people who live through it, that's the whole universe cracking. The stories that grow from it are local, rooted in particular rivers and mountains, and they look similar across the globe because the basic ingredients of disaster are similar. Another is the regional cluster idea. Here, instead of countless isolated events, we imagine a handful of truly enormous episodes. Vast floods as ice sheets collapsed, centuries of unstable climate at the end of the last ice age, major eruptions or impacts that blanketed half a hemisphere in ash and strange weather. In this picture, you don't have one worldwide catastrophe, but you do have zones where, for generations, everything feels off. Seasons skewed, coastlines creeping inland, storms arriving in patterns no one remembers. A whole belt of cultures around the same sea or mountain chain might preserve layered memories of that long troubled time. Then there's story diffusion. Humans travel, slowly at first, then faster. Traders, exiles, brides, prisoners of war, wandering specialists, they all carry tales. A community that has never seen the sea can borrow the shape of a sea flood story from neighbours and pour its own fears and experiences into it. The skeleton of the myth travels farther than the people who first told it. Over centuries, original places and dates blur, but the outline of the water came up, a few survived, a new order began, keeps finding new homes. And finally, there is shared psychology. Even without any particular disaster in common, human beings faced with uncertainty dependence on weather, and the fragility of food supplies will imagine certain kinds of endings more easily than others. Water that rises and does not stop, fire that grows out of control, a sun that does not appear one morning, then another, then another. The mind rehearses these possibilities in story form, the way it rehearses danger in dreams. In the present, it's hard to weigh these explanations precisely. They overlap, they reinforce each other, they differ from case to case. But future evidence can tighten the picture. Better paleoclimate records, more detailed ice cores, lake sediments, cave formations, can tell us exactly when certain regions went through sharp, sudden changes. Mega droughts, abrupt floods, weirdly cold summers. If those line up with archaeological signs of abandonment or cultural change, and with oral traditions in the same areas, the case for a historical core under specific myths grows stronger. Underwater archaeology along continental shelves could reveal drowned river valleys, old shorelines dotted with settlements, evidence of people coping with rising seas in real time. Finding villages that were abandoned in stages as the water advanced or overwhelmed all at once would give us real timelines to compare with legends. Refined dating techniques, radiocarbon, luminescence, genetic clocks can help stack events in the right order. Did this eruption happen before or after that cultural shift? Did this population collapse line up with this known climate jolt? The closer we can pin those down, the easier it becomes to see whether multiple cultures might be remembering the same upheaval, or different ones that just look alike from a distance. The idea of a single, global, all-at-once catastrophe is tempting. It offers a neat answer, one event to rule them all, one disaster echoing down through every mythic tradition. But it is also the hardest to demonstrate. The geological record does show enormous events, giant eruptions, big impacts, rapid sea level rise, but they leave specific, datable fingerprints. So far, nothing in the last few tens of thousands of years has turned up that matches a truly simultaneous planet-wide apocalypse on the human timescale. What we see instead is a patchwork. Some regions hammered while others muddle through, some cultures collapsing while others adapt and even flourish. A cautious reading of the evidence suggests something subtler and, in its own way, more unsettling. The shared memories of endings may not point to one day when the whole world almost died. They may be testifying to a long age when the world was simply less stable than the one most of us know. Coastlines on the move, ice sheets melting, forests shifting north or vanishing altogether, rivers carving new paths in a single violent season. Skies that, from time to time, really did turn strange for years. For people living close to the land, that would have felt like walking on a floor that never quite stopped tilting. So what we can say is this: our ancestors were not dreaming up apocalypses in a vacuum. They lived in landscapes that changed under their feet, in climates that could swing from generous to lethal in a few unlucky years. Their ends of the world probably braided together real floods and fires and winters with the deeper, quieter work of the human mind. The need to find meaning, to warn, to remember. What we cannot say, at least not honestly yet, is that there was one single night or one single wave behind every story. The truth is likely messier, less cinematic, and more human. Many worlds ending over and over, stitched into a single long tapestry of survival. As we move towards sleep, you might let that be the resting point. Not a final answer, but a kind of truce with uncertainty. The old stories are doing what they were always meant to do. They remind us that the ground can shift, that seas can rise, that fire and darkness can come without warning. But they also whisper something softer. People have faced this before. They watched their worlds break and still found ways to begin again. So if we have to tuck all of this into one simple sleep-sized thought, it might be this. You don't need one perfect world-spanning catastrophe to explain why so many ancient cultures remember the end of everything. A more modest, and probably more realistic picture is enough. Over tens of thousands of years, different communities ran into their own hard stops. Floods that wiped out the lower fields, eruptions that turned a bright morning into midnight, years when the wind went wrong and nothing grew. Each one was local, but for the people inside it, it was absolute. Their valley, their coastline, their kingdom, that was the world. When it fell, the world ended. Those endings left scars. They were told and retold, polished into stories that could be carried by memory alone. Then people moved. Hunters followed herds. Sailors hugged new coasts. Traders stitched distant rivers together. With them went the bones of those old tales, the waters that rose, the fires that fell, the long winter that would not end. On the road, those bones picked up new flesh. A flood that began in one delta became, in a new land, the story of a lake or an inland sea. A tale that started as history slid, over generations, into myth. At the same time, even in places without a clear disaster behind them, human minds kept circling the same anxious possibilities. What if the sea did not stop? What if the sky went dark and stayed that way? Real events gave us sharp images. Travelling motifs spread them around. Shared psychology made them stick. Does that mean we can point to one eruption, one impact, one meltwater pulse, and say, here, this is the flood of Noah and Utnapishtim and Manu and the turtle that holds up the world? Not yet. Maybe not ever. The honest answer is that several explanations are probably working at once, and the weights may change from story to story, from coast to coast. Some myths might sit almost directly on top of remembered events. Others may be mosaics stitched from borrowed pieces, dreams of danger, and the quiet pressure of living in a changeable world. It's all right to let those possibilities coexist. As you drift towards sleep, you don't have to decide between them. You can hold in your mind a planet where seas rose and fell, ice advanced and retreated, mountains shrugged, and people watched anxiously, and also a species that, no matter what happened, kept making sense of it in words. Because through all of this, one thing did not end. People endured. They climbed to higher ground. They rebuilt their houses a little farther from the river. They learned which clouds meant trouble and which winds meant safety. They grieved, they adapted, and they folded what they'd learned into stories so their children wouldn't walk blind into the same storms. Those stories reached us, in fragments, in scriptures, in epics, in quiet fireside tales. They are how the old world says goodnight to the new one. So as you lie there, maybe with distant traffic sounding like surf, or a night breeze like leaves on some vanished forest, you are part of that same line. A descendant of people who watched worlds end and still found mornings worth waking up for. If you'd like to help this little channel keep telling their stories, you can gently tap like or subscribe or leave a comment. It makes a real difference. And if you're still awake enough to type, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. A city, a village, a ship at sea, whatever your shore looks like tonight. For now, let the old world rest. Let the waters be calm, the mountains quiet, the sky untroubled. Good night, from their world to yours.